Greetings, friends. My name is Jessa McLean, and I'm here to provide you with some blueprints of disruption. This weekly podcast is dedicated to amplifying the work of activists, examining power structures, and sharing the success stories from the grassroots. Through these discussions, we hope to provide folks with the tools and the inspiration they need to start to dismantle capitalism, decolonize our spaces, and bring about the political revolution that we know we need. Welcome, Raul. Can you introduce yourself to our audience, please?
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and share some of our work. I'm an organizer with the Canadian Freelance Union, part of Unifor, but I'm here as part of the Venezuela Solidarity Coalition. I'm also a longtime activist in Toronto within the Latinx community. Building North-South solidarity has been my focus, specifically with Latin America. I'm originally from Colombia. I originally got very interested in Venezuela, very specifically in the early 2000s, around the constitutional reforms that were taking place. It was very inspirational for many of us here in Canada. You know, we were thinking of a country like Venezuela, who for the first time in its Republican history had, taken power in terms of reshaping the wealth for the majority and taking over natural resources. So, the refounding of Venezuela was very interesting. And so I started going down to Venezuela since, the late 2000s as a elections observer, meeting with social movements. And my focus was to bring civil society from Canada, labor activists to meet and build solidarity with Venezuelans in Venezuela.
Well, aren't you the perfect person to be talking to right now? Thank you, Kerr. Honestly, I have a whole new list of questions now after that introduction. I couldn't help but hear elections observer. I mean, I don't know if we just jump right into that, but, do you want to comment on the type of elections that are in Venezuela briefly? Because that is the crux of a lot of the arguments that the Canadian government is using. Maybe we'll read Carney's statement later, maybe not. But that it's an illegitimate government, that it is a dictatorship, that the elections that they hold are not valid. So surely, I'm sure you have an opinion on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think for me, what ended up happening was the disconnect from when I was going to Venezuela and meeting with social movements and hearing about the work that they were doing with the communal councils, with, participatory democracy. And then in North America and hearing the mainstream media, hearing that it was authoritarian and it didn't represent the people was kind of a disconnect. So I managed to become an elections observer for the 2010 elections and kind of to understand and see how that worked. And I was blown away by, first, how participatory and how democratic and transparent the electoral process was, in the country-wise, and just seeing how politicized, Venezuelans were during that period, and still today, but obviously much more during that period. I'm talking about like massive lineups where people were like in Canada, elections are kind of something people, whatever, it comes and people do it and they just kind of passes. But in Venezuela, there were people, when I was traveling down there, would gather in the public courtyards and circles with the Venezuelan Constitution, the little blue book. They would all have it in their pockets, debating the articles of the Constitution, debating everything that, would come up. So I was like, it was very impressive. And seeing the electoral process personally, we're talking about one of the most, so at the time, especially even today, when I compared to the Canadian elections, where I was a scrutinizer at the recent, elections here in Canada, where we're still doing everything in paper. There, they had, it was all digital, right? So a lot of it was computerized, and they also had paper. So it would be very difficult to say that the elections weren't transparent. Obviously, the Carter Center at one point said it was one of the most, impressive electoral processes in the world, other electoral commissions. But, I started to realize that was used as a political tool to, diminish the participatory nature of the elections. But for me, it was amazing. And I started taking delegations down there from labor delegations and civil society activists. And we all felt the same thing. We were pretty much impressed. And what I found is that, independent observers from commissions from Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, who would go there, would all say the same thing. It was transparent, it was participatory, it was democratic. But then when you get the traditional institutions and the government, I guess voices would always be that it was the opposite, right? So that disconnect became very clear to me. And I started to realize that obviously the mainstream media was lying to us or misinforming us around what was happening in Venezuela.
have to digest all of that because it is very different from what you hear, right? I gotta admit, I myself, I'm Colombian as well. Man, you hear a lot of shit in Colombia about Venezuela, especially from the upper classes, which are a lot of the people that I know in Colombia. You hear a lot of things, a lot of propaganda, and here in Canada, you hear a lot of propaganda. And when it comes to the elections, even though I myself, I've studied as a journalist, I know how to do research, and it's even still finding the information about like the legitimacy about the elections and stuff. They make it so difficult. It's really hard for me to have ever had like a strong stance on that because of how difficult the propaganda machine makes it to get that information. So for me, I'm just digesting everything you just said. It's very interesting.
But I think that's a perfect point, Santiago, just in terms of, when it comes to a lot of these issues, there is so much information that's put out there and misinformation that it becomes difficult for people to like decipher it. And then in most cases, what I find people just kind of default to like, then I don't know and I don't want to get involved, right? Because it's too complicated or there's just too much information. So I think that's part of it is just you inundate people with all this information. Most of it is misinformation. You read one report, they're good elections, another one they're bad, and then you're just like, you know what, this doesn't make any sense. And then I just take like a neutral stance. I don't want to get involved in this because it's too complicated. But I mean, absolutely in Venezuela, the Bolivarian Revolution, which is, kind of the term that's more used for Venezuela, is, it's a process that has been incredibly inspirational, not just for Venezuelans, but for the whole region. What what the Bolivarian Revolution means for people across Latin America and the Caribbean is something that I think one of the reasons why the empire, the Canadian state had to ensure that it didn't succeed, right? Beyond the oil, which obviously is very important. It's the example that an alternative can, be within the region. It could have socialist tendencies. It could have a participatory nature, and it could benefit the majority of people in the country. To me, that is something that scares and is a problem for the empire, and it has to be eradicated, similar to what Cuba had to do. Because if you compare what the Bolivarian Revolution was doing, from 2000 to 2010 in terms of its regional reach, I mean, it was incredible. It had created UNASUR, Petrocaribe. It to some sense created regional integration, to some extent, not fully. It was building alternative media, right? Like Telesur, right? Again, allowing people from Latin America to kind of share their own stories and their own voices as opposed to be kind of told from the people in the North. And that was inspiring, but also it created an alternative political project, obviously very regional, but, it was a viable alternative that was, inspirational and created things that, today we would, free education, free medicine, free housing, right? Building housing for people, which is something that we're living in a housing crisis, right? And we can't, in a, rich capitalist country, supposedly where, all this can be solved relatively fast. You see, it doesn't happen, right? So for us, that kind of really created an alternative that many people pointed to. And I think that is something that had to be kind of extinguished. And to some extent over the last, with sanctions and many other factors, has to somewhat diminished the influence and the power of the Bolivarian Revolution in a material sense regionally.
I think that explanation helps folks understand why, despite Carney's willingness to speak ill will of Trump, and his other imperialist endeavors, he was just step in step with him in terms of Venezuela. I read over the statement again just before we came on air here, and I mean, he doesn't mince his words, right? At one point he says, Canada has not recognized the illegitimate regime of Maduro since it stole the 2018 election. That's a very straightforward. Normally they do glossier words than this, but just a basic condemnation with a little bit of a tokenism to international law near the end. But, using the example of the Bolivarian inspiration, and helps explain it a little bit, but and maybe I'm wrong. It seems like it accelerated around 2018, 19 when we're looking at Canada Venezuela relations, where Canada seemed to ramp it up a little bit in their determination for regime change in Venezuela, right? Closing the embassy, the sanctions, maybe you can tell it, like, they just keep increasing the amount of sanctions, increasing the amount of people listed on the sanctions. But all of this seemed to really spark in 2018. But if I'm wrong, can let me know, or can you help us understand the history of Canada Venezuela relations that's gotten them to this point?
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely accelerated around that point, but that Canadian foreign policy towards Venezuela has been, bipartisan in terms of it. Conservatives, liberals, it was very similar policy. Harper was no friend to Venezuela and referred to it as a dictator, and mitigated any kind of relations with Venezuela from that perspective. So absolutely, under Justin Trudeau, it did accelerate somewhat, but it's also was a period of transition, and I think potentially, the way I look at it was a geopolitical time where the powers that be, I would say from 2015 to 2020, is where the transition where Hugo Chavez dies in 2014 and Maduro takes power in 2015. The National Assembly at that time also wins elections. I mean, this was a country that was considered anti-democratic, and here the opposition wins the elections, and then they're like, oh, of course, these elections are legitimate. Every other election in history has been illegitimate in Venezuela, but this one, when we won the National Assembly, is very legitimate, so we'll take it, right? And so, I would say all the powers were aligned against the Bolivarian Revolution. The iconic leader of Hugo Chavez had passed away. Maduro, who's relatively, new as a sort of a leader, he wasn't somebody who, kind of people recognized that much, took over the mantle. Sanctions were being imposed. The Venezuelan opposition had been very much emboldened by support from Canada, whether financial or the U.S. political support. There's what we had in like 2016, 17, 18, the guarimbas, which were heavy-duty protests by the opposition. They would violent in many cases. They would block the streets. People couldn't go to school. People couldn't go to work. If you tried to cross, the guarimbas, which are basically just like barricades in like neighborhoods that were controlled by the opposition, you could be hurt. You could be killed in some instances. So people wouldn't go to work. They wouldn't go to school. Commerce kind of put it. So I think, everybody saw that, okay, this is the moment where we're going to apply maximum pressure, because the analysis that I'm pretty sure I've read this somewhere, that Canada had thought that at this point, Venezuela will definitely, there'll be a coup and things are going to change. But if we look back at, in terms of, I guess, the Canada's policy, I think it really started, I would say, in earnest when Hugo Chavez, and this became kind of a big thing, really criticized the violence against the Palestinian people by the Israeli state, right? So in terms of, and cut ties with Israel, recalled its ambassador. And that's when Erwin Cotler, who's the darling of Canadian politics, he was a member of parliament, kind of became very, I would say, I don't want to say offended, that seems a little bit too simplistic, but that's when they realized that, okay, working closely with the Zionist lobby globally and in Venezuela, they pretty much said that the Bolivarian Revolution and Hugo Chavez were anti-Semites, and they had to do anything they can to remove Hugo Chavez. So Erwin Cotler played a huge role in influencing that, so much so that he got an award by the Venezuelan opposition. They invited him to Venezuela. He led a lot of this stuff around, what Christopher Freeland was doing. That, and I can talk a little bit about that. But I think that's sort of kind of, I would say that, in my opinion, a large part of the impetus to really make Canada go full throttle against, at that time, Hugo Chavez.
People forget, I think, that Israel's not a neutral player in South America either. I mean, in Colombia, the IDF has been training paramilitaries that murder social leaders, union leaders. Israel isn't neutral to Latin America. They're an imperialist force as well.
Oh no, they're actually very proactive in terms of destabilization, training paramilitaries, providing intel to the opposition. No, absolutely. What Israel is doing to the Palestinians, which is clear and obvious to everybody now, is a genocide, and how they're treating the Palestinians. They use what they're doing against the Palestinian people. Whether it's incarceration, uh, torture, right? Surveillance, all that it gets used, across Latin America and other countries. I'm focused in my specialty is more Latin America, so I can't speak as, to other regions, but I'm sure it's not very, very different in terms of that type of militarization and control to undermine progressive movements in Latin America that don't support or would, support a Zionist kind of mindset.
Did the emergence of the Venezuelan Solidarity Coalition coincide with the escalation of hostilities? I mean, Canada likes to pretend they're non-violent interventions, but they're just as hostile, right? But can you tell us a little bit more about what organizing looked like in Canada before the abduction of Maduro? I feel like it's almost like talking about Palestine in that, believe me, there were activists here on the ground with things to do in terms of Venezuela before our renewed attention and the latest kind of violation there. But can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So, I'll start with probably about 10 years ago, we had coalitions on, solidarity with Venezuela. The goal was, education of the Canadian public and to build links, as I said. So our goal was to bring people to Latin America, particularly labor, civil society organizations, to get an understanding. Because we saw quickly, if you go and see it for yourself, you right away see there's like a dimensionally different view. Just to give you an example, obviously they always say that Venezuela is a authoritarian, and then you go to Venezuela, and if you go for elections, for example, the first thing you see is large protests in opposition of the government, and then you're like, well, in what authoritarian government are large protests? No, not protests, rallies. Protest rallies, it could be whatever, calling for the end of the government. It's the only country that I've ever seen where it allows that kind of stuff. Usually, any country that does that, it would an opposition would be militarized, they would be shot at. It was the total opposite. So you kind of could quickly see. So at the same time, you'd be interviewing Venezuelan opposition members, they're going down with Hugo Chavez, and then they'd be like, but this country is very repressive, and they're on the street saying that, and they got controls over the streets. So it was very ironic. So a lot of the work, going back 10, 15 years ago with the Latin American activists and the organization I was with back then, which was Common Frontiers, which is linked with the labor movement, was really focused on bringing people down to Venezuela and building that one-on-one connection, trying to build links with labor. So our goal was really, how do we build link with some of the institutions in Venezuela, as opposed to just activists or political parties, because obviously, they're more partisan. So to build links with the labor movement, and also an important component was also to give people an opportunity to understand what are the alternatives that are taking place in the comunas, right, from a participatory nature. Like, can people really vote for a constitution like that? This just seems odd for us. Like, the people in Latin America and specifically in Venezuela voted for constitutional amendments, put forward constitutional amendments, which for me, it sounds like I never thought we could do that. I didn't think that was possible. I thought just lawyers did that. I thought just academics and experts, like, who am I to put forward a constitution? So, those are which was for me a complete mind shift in terms of, politics and how we do that. And so that was really kind of the genesis. But it was very difficult because, as Santiago mentioned, the misinformation that came out from the mainstream media was very difficult for us to overcome. And in most conversations, people are like, well, no, I don't understand how, and it became a bit of an argument, like, I guess, a debate. And this is something that even within progressive circles, which I think happens all the time, and it's happening again, it's like, well, we support Venezuela, but, was it democratic enough? Like, was the election, it wasn't as democratic as it should have been. Was there enough participation? Was every sector participating? So it becomes, you get kind of like lost in this debate. And so it was very hard to build solidarity on a large scale. We had, small support. So, for example, from a labor perspective, the labor movement in Canada wasn't very keen to get involved or make any statements whatsoever. The only union at the time, and it's been now for probably about a while, that has links with Venezuela is CUPW, right? The postal workers, and they have a project and they provide some support for the postal workers in Venezuela, and they have that, link workers to workers, which is what all unions in Canada have done in Latin America. Like, it was kind of, and we were like, so why wouldn't you do it in Venezuela? So that's where we kind of heard, okay, it was kind of, the history of anti-communism, and like, oh no, they call themselves socialists. So you kind of, you realize that there was those barriers here in Canada around building links with labor movement that wasn't necessarily pro-capitalist and building the same kind of model that we're building here in Canada. So I think that was a bit of a challenge. But over the last year or so, where we've seen and also it was also to end the sanctions. So the most important component that we were asking for the Canadian government was like, call for an end of the sanctions that impact a lot of people, and we can talk a little bit about what that impact means. But most importantly is we were hoping, and I mean, we tried to hope that the Canadian government would act as if you help us build dialogue between the government and the opposition, right? So the role that Canada should play, the best role that Canada can play is dialogue, like, as opposed to just supporting the opposition unilaterally, rather play a role of a bridge builder, so we can have dialogue. And that was what we tried to do for a long time, going back about 10 years. But now I think it's become very clear for most folks, from what we see from, the economic embargo that, physically that has taken place with ships, battleships and planes, surrounding Venezuela, to the recent illegal and violent kidnapping of President Maduro, is that U.S. imperialism, right, and U.S. foreign policy is the biggest threat to global stability, to global peace. And so that argument has become easier for us in terms of that we don't have to convince you, is it the most democratic country in the world? Is it the most participatory? Just like, just saw what happened. And yes, we all agree that this is not a good thing for anybody, right? And even for Canadians who aren't maybe as interested in what's going on, or not as in tune, they realize, like, can this happen to Canada? We hear it, the U.S. talk about Greenland, right? So we're like, oh, okay, so maybe, it's not a good thing for Canada, right? So people start, when it's happening in your own backyard, let's say that, Canada, Greenland, a nation that's, I would say, in my opinion, there's also a bit of racism in this, where these are just folks from the global south that people don't give a care, they don't care as much. But once you start impacting, people in the north end, maybe it's important. You start to see, so the community is right now, it's organizing around, ending the sanctions, respecting the sovereignty of Venezuela. But it's obviously very difficult because the U.S. has a complete kind of hold on Venezuela right now. It's kind of like negotiating with Venezuela with a boot on their neck type thing.
Just want to point out the hypocrisy. I mean, you started to, for sure, but in Carney's statement, repeatedly, he does mention the Venezuelan people's right to sovereignty, and that, they've long supported that. Yet Greenland is just being talked about at this point, and Canada's ready to send troops, right? Like, it's an actual defense of sovereignty that one would expect. I mean, that's the whole point of all of their military spending, apparently, right? So, but when it comes to Venezuela, it's a real kind of like, this is our idea of support when Trump is doing it. You mentioned, Trump making it a little bit easy. His hubris and his overt imperialism makes it a little bit easier to get the support of labor. We've seen some pretty positive statements, obviously coming from CUPW and CUPE, but even the CLC. I mean, the president misstepped a little bit on social media there. I'll give her a bit of grace. She tried to center Canadian jobs a little bit, missing the point. But overall, the CLC...
It's bad for Canadian jobs kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, you can make the argument yes or no, but you know what I'm saying. It's not the priority there. It's not really what people should be focused on. But they did issue kind of a lengthier statement that was pretty decent. How are you feeling about Labor's response? Do you think you would have had this response from them had it been a Democrat using a little bit more savvy pretense to abduct Maduro rather than, Trump going, I need their oil, that's my oil, and Canada, you're next kind of vibe, right? If it had been different circumstances, would we have seen this kind of support?
Probably not. I think that, if it wasn't so overt and so aggressive and, so clearly a violation of international law, of sovereignty, and also putting Canada in the position currently where we're having our struggles with the U.S. in terms of tariff war and us becoming, state of the U.S. I think that kind of there's a context there for that. But regardless, I think the Canadian labor movement has done, their statements have been great, and their support, and also from the labor movement, globally, has been very strong in support of Venezuela, and predominantly is, the respect for sovereignty, right, the respect for international law. This has been kind of an important this point for a long time. It's like, this is not about Maduro. It's not about whether you like Bolivarianism. Doesn't matter if you like socialism. It's not about that. It could be as very simple as like, do you believe in national sovereignty? Do you believe in international law? Right? Simple things like that where Canada has pushed. That has been our kind of epitaph for the longest time. We support more, the rules based order type of thing, right? That's when you realize, like, okay, so the labor movement has done a great job, and I think it should be commended, and they've come out in support, and they're supporting the work that the Venezuela Solidarity Coalition are doing. They're putting out statements to their members, so it's something that we didn't have in the past, but it's understandable because it was difficult. I'll give you an example. I mean, in 2019, QP put out a statement when we took a delegation to Venezuela for elections monitoring. And I think that one of their statements, they said, and the president of Venezuela, and the fact that they said that he was the president, I think the National Post came out with like a hit piece and just been like, QP supports a dictator, and it caused a lot of commotion. Like it made it very difficult. So you realize that there was that, and it happens. It's pretty obvious right now within the Palestinian solidarity movement, where you're trying to shut down anybody who speaks, to get people fired, to get people arrested. Right, that type of pressure, it really works in Canada, especially around institutions like labor. And so they had to be very careful. So they just stayed really quiet. It got so bad that one of their members actually ran for president to try to unseat the president because of that, like just because of that issue. That's how kind of polarizing it became for QP. So they were like, we ain't going to say anything about Venezuela. It doesn't matter what our opinion is at this point. We'll just keep it to ourselves. That's kind of the way I saw it going forward.
A political hot potato. They'd rather collective bargaining agreements are a little simpler.
And international issues aren't, the bread and butter of labor, right? So they're like, why are we going to get into a fight around this? We need to focus on other things.
All right. Well, knowing where our government sits on this right now and the history and their motivations, where do you think the best pressure is? Like, where are you pushing your appeals? You mobilizing the masses, but to what end?
Sure. So, first is ensuring that Canada, I think it's Bill, I'm trying to remember the Bill C233, I think it is, the one that the private members bill that's ensuring that no Canadian arms or military equipment goes to the U.S. or to Israel or anybody. Like there's kind of closing that loophole, right? So ensuring that Canada, any of our military equipment, which we're against, but obviously we have it there, and ensuring that the U.S. doesn't receive it and then uses it as a loophole to send to other countries around the world that are engaged in egregious violations of human rights, genocide, like in Israel. That's an important pressure point, ensuring that we close those loopholes that a lot of other organizations have been talking about and putting forward. Rachel Small, the coordinator,
World Beyond War.
Beyond War, obviously, who've been talking about it and put out an awesome paper around that it's still taking place. So that kind of pressure is important from a parliamentary perspective. Being out on the street and being visible and just calling out what it is, which is just naked and aggressive imperialism that is unacceptable. That we're not going to stand by and just allow this to happen anywhere in the world, right? So I think those have been kind of key components around, the parliamentary, ensuring that the labor movement and other institutional organizations in Canada continue their support. And so education is around that. So we're going back to like, how can we educate our members around these issues within the context of, an imperialist nation that now has become quite obvious? Because when we said in the past, they really want the oil, they were like, no, we're there for democracy. We're there for human rights, because that has been the historical argument against Venezuela, is that it's a country that's a dictatorship that violates human rights. That's why Canada, through Irwin Cotler, tried to take Venezuela to the International Court of Justice, right? Back in 2017, they actually said like, hey, this is egregious human rights violations taking place in Venezuela. And so, and it was ironic because I was reading some of the transcripts of Irwin Cotler when I think this was part of an OAS kind of report. And he said one of the things that really bothered him was like the collective punishment that was being unleashed by the state on the Venezuelan people through food, right? Lack of food, right? Which is exactly what the sanctions do. And yet, the sanctions against Venezuela is one of the biggest issues is around access to food, access to medicine. And so he never said a word around that when the U.S. was, imposing sanctions on Venezuela and causing hundreds of thousands of people to die. But yet he was very concerned, supposedly that the Chavista government was using food as a collective tool, a weapon of war against, poor Venezuelans.
In the same way you talked about the elections, can you help us understand how these sanctions work? A lot of folks don't know the details or how they end up killing thousands of people. Can you help explain what that's done to Venezuela over time?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, it's important to mention that these sanctions are illegal and violate international law because they're unilateral by the United States. They're not sanctioned by the UN, so they're completely illegal, and it's not something that anybody should be supporting at any time. They're devastating because the sanctions were specifically put on the PDVSA, which is the Venezuelan oil company. Unfortunately for Venezuela, it has tons of oil, the largest reserves in the world for oil. But at the same time, Venezuela has never really, it's a petrostate and it never really produced much beyond selling oil. So as soon as you put sanctions on the Venezuelan state, which is, it's who owns the oil and produces it all, then you basically cut off, 98% of revenue for the Venezuelan state. And obviously that revenue is what's used to purchase food, to, buy, to build housing, all that type of stuff. So it obviously, the country went from, flush with cash to little by little, all its revenue cut off because it can't buy anything on the international market. It can't make any purchases through our SWIFT system. Nobody wants to engage in any transactions with Venezuela, even if it's not related, if you're not buying anything, because you fear that potentially you could get caught up in the web and people are just are cautious. I mean, I'll give you a couple of examples. Obviously, sanctions make it, impossible to buy food, to buy medicine, because you can't make a payment for that food or for that medicine on any international system because you can't make an interaction with the government. But on top of that, things like, these are like things that are so simple. Like, so Venezuela, the PDVSA also had like a charity arm that would pay for, kids who had cancer or who had, needed a bone marrow transplant to travel to another country to get that done. As soon as the sanction hit, the PDVSA couldn't pay for that. So obviously the kids would stop, the treatment or the adults, and they could die. In many cases, they did, right? So simple things like that. Things like baseball, right? Like baseball players from the U.S. stopped going to the U.S. from the MLS because they couldn't get paid from, the state, right? Who was paying baseball players who would go and pay on the off season. So, simple things like that, where people didn't realize that, wow, sanctions are just on individuals, but it created, a huge catastrophe. There was a report by the United Nations rapporteur, Alfred Zayas, I remember his name. He stated back in 2010 that there was about 100,000 deaths that, he could link or could be linked to sanctions. That was just, that's like a rough estimate. But, malnutrition started to take place. 7 million Venezuelans, and even more, depending on what numbers that, started to leave their country. because of the dire economic situation. So hospitals don't have access to penicillin, doctors don't have access to basic material. You can a lot of the equipment or some of the equipment that Venezuela would have might be American made or from you can't buy parts for it. If something breaks down, you can't buy anything new. So clearly, the infrastructure in Venezuela, from medical, housing, has totally, been destroyed from an inability to purchase anything in the market. And anything they could purchase would have been at exorbitant rates. It would have been at a risk of the person providing them. It would have been very difficult. So even the fact that Venezuela sells oil, it would have to sell it to, say, it started to sell more oil to China and Russia and Iran. It's a lot more costlier for Venezuela to do that than to sell it to the U.S., which it had been doing for a long time. So even simple things like that, where you're getting much less for the oil that you're selling. So it caused the deaths of many people, malnutrition, and really destroyed the whole infrastructure, and to a large extent weakened the Bolivarian project. So obviously it had a human toll, but it also politically weakened the Bolivarian project, where it had to basically just focus on survival, which, in my opinion, is what it's been, over the last, 5-6 years.
It's frustrating to hear just like how destabilizing the sanctions are, because quite often even your most progressive politicians will settle on sanctions, right? It's the military intervention that is their red line, but they seem perfectly content in using political means like sanctions to, not that the ends that they're going for are noble, but which they think are in the best Canadian interests. If the CLC is right and there's jobs to lose with the Americans taking over Venezuela, good luck with that. But what does the Canadian state have to gain from taking this kind of risky position? Or is it, maybe it's not politically risky. How do you feel the Canadian public feels about this? About not only the abduction of Maduro, but the prospect of further U.S. military intervention. And surely if Canada took the position it did already on something so violent, I can only imagine they're not going to intervene on behalf of the people of Venezuela.
Yeah, I mean, Canada hasn't had, in my opinion, an independent foreign policy from the U.S. in a long time, so it's not going to start. It's not going to start now, especially not
except
around
on Greenland.
Yeah, at least on statement-wise, right? So, so I don't foresee much of change. It doesn't matter. I mean, the U.S. has done what is probably the most egregious thing at the moment. And if most countries, especially Canada, have done nothing, I don't think they're going to do anything else at this point. But I mean, in terms of, I think the idea that more oil on the market, it's competition to Canada. I think for me it just shows kind of like a self-centeredness of Canada, where like this issue, although a head of state has been abducted, people have been killed, a national sovereignty, international law has been violated. The most important thing in this conversation is our jobs. So I find that completely asinine in terms of that's really the point of discussion, right? And again, it's to create that fear, like, doesn't matter what happens here. Like, this isn't good for us, right? Anything that comes out of Venezuela, the global south, it's not good for Canadians, and we need to be worried about it, right? Because, then that oil is going to be some kind of bad oil. I don't know, but, so I guess that, maybe it's motivated our prime minister to go to China and say like, okay, let's build, better links. I don't know, like maybe there's that fear. But yeah, I think that in itself is crazy. But I do think the Canadians kind of see beyond that, the labor movement, and they're calling it out for what this is. And it really just makes the Canadian government look absurd, right? It makes it obviously inconsistent in terms of its policy, as you mentioned, with Greenland, Ukraine. We see a very different kind of behavior when with that perspective. So the Canadian government just, I think, lacks credibility from that perspective on an international scene, and it's just showing what it really is, which is a lackey of the United States in terms of foreign policy. And that is what I hope as Canadians kind of get angry about that, and especially as we see how Trump is also treating Canada, that Canadians finally stand up and say, you know what, we need an independent policy from the U.S. And push for that. And, in upcoming elections, whether it's regional, provincial, political, in the future, that should be an important component. I think that should now be part of our regular dialogue when talking about political leaders in our country.
Despite seemingly being in a crisis at the moment, right? I know Venezuela, this isn't their first time facing forces of regime change, but it is in a bit of a crisis. Are you organizing like that right now, or do you feel like you're still playing a bit of a long game? Can you give us an idea of what the Venezuelan Solidarity Coalition is doing to further the mission they already have, but then to also react to what's happening now and, capitalize on our attention right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like all of us, we're kind of, Venezuela has been under attack for a long time since the start of the Bolivarian Revolution, but nobody expected this type of sort of aggressive, vile nature of attack. And so everybody was kind of playing more the long game and saying, let's do education, let's try to have people understand what's going on. But right now it's become so okay, this is become, you have to kind of react to the extreme conditions we're in, which is right now it's really we got to condemn, it's got to be out on the street. We got to create a wider tent than we have in the past of just, progressive leftists who are in solidarity and go down and kind of enjoy those trips and meet people and have an important relationship and kind of build larger within the labor movement, within peace activists. So also understanding that, these issues are all linked, right? The destruction of the environment with more, Venezuelan oil on the market that's going to be, put forward by, U.S. corporations, it's going to contribute to the climate crisis, the militarization, right? So I think an important component is the anti-war movement, right? That, in the past might not have been in the purview of the Venezuelan solidarity groups. Is it's clear that, the U.S. intervention, the U.S. militarization, which is happening everywhere, right? The police state, all that type of stuff. We have to kind of have broader analysis around these issues, the struggle against ICE in the U.S., right? These kind of issues are all part of what we're talking about, where, states are just militarizing, criminalizing any type of dissent. And that needs to be part of kind of the larger discussion and has become a larger discussion for the Venezuelan solidarity coalitions, and including the other struggles like Palestine, of course, within our discussions and part of this narrative.
I know you're not from Venezuela, but Santiago, you have touched on this before. So my question is actually to both of you. Can you talk about what it's like being a member of the diaspora within the imperialist beast? That obligation to do something while being so far away from where it seems to be happening, but also being almost in the heart of it at the same time?
So for me, I'm very Bolivarian in the sense that, I believe in La Patria Grande, which is kind of the larger, I don't necessarily focus just on Colombia because I'm from Colombia. I kind of believe in transcending those regional boundaries, right? The sort of man-made boundaries. And so, when I see the struggle of people, to liberate themselves from, imperialism, from capitalism, it's frustrating. It's obviously angry. There's a frustration perspective when people are trying to do something that's uplifting and progressive, and then the reaction is so vile, from a military perspective, but it's also, it's been a long time coming, right? So I've been doing work around Venezuela for the last 15, close to 20 years, and I've always come up against this. I've always had to why am I always arguing around why is this democratic? Is it really authoritarian? How participatory are the communists? Little things like that. So it's very difficult to be kind of positive in the current situation, especially because it's globally, it's not just unique to Latin America, but Latin America, at least for me, had provided, for the last 15 years, a window of alternativism that was, working in reality and was showing us success and something that we can look to, right? As somebody who's come from the global South, I've always been told oh, you're Colombian, you're a drug dealer, drugs, Colombia. Latin America has always been negative in the purview of people from North America in general. In terms of if I'm Colombian, then, are you a coke dealer? It's always a joke, but, it's kind of underlining. We've never, contributed anything supposedly from the West. When I meet people in the West are from Latin America. But, with the Bolivarian movement, there's something we can point to it. And even like the pink tide movement in Latin America in the 2000s, it was like, here are alternatives that are working. They're not perfect. They have a lot of issues, but they're alternative to capitalism, and they're alternative to like sort of that individualism, hyper militarization that has taken place, where people, individuals and communities were refounding, because that was a big goal of the pink tide movements, with all their challenges of refounding the states, and whether it was in Ecuador and Bolivia with their constitutions, and coming to the North America, and people sort of not understanding that and telling me like, well, no, these are just kind of like, welfare projects that, they'll take into account, and seeing these projects, how transformative they are, has always been a bit of a challenge. And so seeing the naked aggression right now, and still hearing that, it violates what we in the West have always been saying, which is the world order, sovereignty, and yet nobody, our government is very silent. The violation of human rights, assassination of, people in Venezuela when the U.S., invaded Venezuela. Again, silence, right? The genocide that's taking place in Palestine, pretty much has been complete silence, since the Nakba. So the question is, what needs to happen in order for people to finally say, okay, enough is enough. So I guess with what's happened just recently with Venezuela, it seems that potentially that spark is kind of people are like, okay, and mainly it comes from a selfish perspective. It's like I see people go, oh, it could happen to us in Canada, right? So, but at least it's starting to kind of spark for people and say we need to do more. When we're seeing, the militarization, the U.S., the ICE raids, people are starting to realize, oh, this is not just something that happens in other countries. This is happening now. The polarization in the discourse in Canada and the U.S., we see it with conservatives, with Republicans in the U.S. It's now the reality for all of us. And people are starting to realize if we don't do something about it, then we're going to end up in a very, very worse situation than we are now, right? Like we're just seeing that progress. It's just sliding from worse to worse to worse.
Yeah, I feel like looking at how Canada has responded. For one thing, like I feel like we're trying to talk about like, should Canada be worried about an intervention, and then therefore should we expect Canada to respond differently? I gotta be honest, I don't expect much support or any difference from Canada, because Canada is not. I mean, I think Canada is worse than just like a follower of the United States. I think that we give too much credit that like we're just following whatever their foreign policy is. We're also active participants, and I think about in 2019, the coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia is something that is very similar to what's going on right now. That was an undisputably fair election in Bolivia, and Canada did more against Bolivia than even the United States did. And so appealing to any sort of morality from the Canadian government, for me, I don't expect it. And it's, I also feel that frustration. For me, I've been watching everything unfold as somebody who is from the region. It's incredibly frustrating feeling like so far away, and also feeling like we're supposed to here be able to do something here in Canada, be able to accomplish something that you can't accomplish fighting in Colombia, fighting in Venezuela. And yet there being so little accountability here, so little will. And at the same time, I'm very hopeful seeing the response from the communities. So I don't know. That was a bit of a jumbly all over the place, but
I think you raise a good point in terms of, Canada kind of, although it's a follower of U.S. foreign policy, it does have, it has a lot of interest economically, obviously within the mining, which is a great topic that you guys we have in your episodes, right? And it has a lot of political and economic interest globally that, it may hide behind the U.S., but, it's an imperialist country in nature. But what I think for me that it's very disingenuous and hard with Canada is that Canada has this this reputation of being a peacekeeper, a good neighbor, right? Which is totally not something that we should have, and it uses that, right? So Venezuela was a perfect example. You mentioned also Bolivia, and there are many examples, but Canada led the Lima Group, right, in 2017, which was, it didn't include the U.S. Canada played a huge role in putting political pressure through the Lima Group, which was a coalition of right wing or Latin American countries and countries in the OAS to, bring them, basically bring regime change. They said it was just around, human rights in Venezuela. And so it uses that as cover, and many people get kind of confused by it and say, oh, okay, well, if Canada's doing it, then it's going to be a good thing, right? Not understanding Canada's real role. So it's dangerous from that perspective. We may not have the political power that the U.S. has, that just bellicose goes in and like bombs the country, but we have that, that morale for some reason historically that we shouldn't have, and I believe it's unwarranted, but yet we have it and we use it as cover for whether it's U.S. Political interests or Canadian extractive industry interests, banking interests, whatever it might be.
Chrystia Freeland should get a special shout out for that last answer.
Absolutely, yeah.
We've almost rid ourselves of her, but she had a special spot in her heart for Latin America and regime changes, and so I'm not sad to see that one go. But and so
Totally agree.
what I was going to say to Santiago there is, I could feel you trying to find a bright spot at the end, because you're like, we're supposed to end on a high note. And so I'm very hopeful, but you trailed off. So Raul, why don't you leave the audience with some of the actions, remind us that people are doing work on the ground right now to address this.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the Latinx community has been working closely with the labor movement in Toronto and trying to build coalitions nationally and globally with labor movement, pizza activists, activists all across the city to give visibility, obviously, to, what's happened in Venezuela and to condemn it and to call it illegal and to do what you can to try to get President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Cecilia, back home. And also, again, just to ensure that Venezuela can, Venezuelan sovereignty is respected, right? And Venezuela can kind of continue on a course of semi-autonomy from that perspective. So part of the work we're doing is around educational. This Saturday, there's an art build. We're getting people to come together kind of from a social perspective and say, hey, let's socialize, but also talk about these issues in preparation for Saturday, which is the 21st, I think. No, sorry, what's the next, the 23rd. There will be a rally. Yeah, so it's Saturday the 24th, sorry, at 1 p.m. in front of the U.S. consulate, right? Again, would be the second rally we've had. It's to condemn, the aggression, to condemn the violence, to hold the Canadian government accountable and to give visibility to this important issue in terms of, calling for peace and the end of militarization in Canada, North America, and kind of globally. Right. So that's been a lot of the work around visibility and build links with larger movements and links to the different issues we're experiencing, in Canada, whether it's the housing crisis, hyperinflation, the militarization that we're seeing, the anti-immigrant policies, right? The rise of the right-wing movements, because, often these movements are tied, right? The right-wing movements in Canada, the U.S., in Venezuela, right? The Zionist movement, they don't stop and they're not contained by geography necessarily, borders, right? So they're definitely working together to undermine, democracy and law, whatever that may be. So that's what we're trying to build, those links with other civil society organizations across Canada, and to give visibility and just to go out there and kind of yell and say we're angry and this is not acceptable, right? And take it to, the diversity of tactics that people need to do in order to confront a violent and hostile state.
Well, it's never been easier for Carney to now pivot away from U.S. foreign policy. He might as well just scoop up Venezuela in the pile, right? Just distance
Absolutely.
ourselves altogether. I'm here for that. I very much appreciate the time, Raul. I know it's again all hands on deck, I imagine, but the importance of creating third spaces and doing things like art builds. I heard you kind of scoff as though maybe that didn't sound urgent, but those are so important, especially when both of y'all just admitted that you feel frustrated and there's angst there. And so we can't live in that angst all the time. So I love when I actually see organizations doing this amidst all of the other kind of harder, rallying in January isn't the easiest thing. So keeping people's hearts warm is important.
You're right. It's kind of rebuilding that sense of community, right? That often, when we're in these crises, one of the kind of go-to is like you just want to become insular. You want to just focus on my world, my needs, my space, protect it to make sure you're least impacted. And then the last thing we want to do is kind of build that collective. So it's, again, reminding ourselves that we need to build those collective spaces for collective power, right? Because that's the only way that we can confront the beast in the belly of the beast.
That is a wrap on another episode of Blueprints of Disruption. Thank you for joining us. Also, a very big thank you to the producer of our show, Santiago Halu Quintero. Blueprints of Disruption is an independent production operated cooperatively. You can follow us on Twitter at BP of Disruption. If you'd like to help us continue disrupting the status quo, please share our content, and if you have the means, consider becoming a patron. Not only does our support come from the progressive community, so does our content. So reach out to us and let us know what or who we should be amplifying. So until next time, keep disrupting.